Officer Thomas Barnes is a man of routine, enforcing the law in a small southern town where old prejudices still linger beneath the surface. But when a routine traffic stop turns violent, Barnes finds himself in the middle of a national scandal. The man he assaulted is no ordinary citizen. He's General Elijah Carter, a highly respected U.S. Army officer. As Barnes confronts the fallout of his actions, he learns of a buried connection between his own estranged father and the man he brutalized. In a town where racial tensions run deep, Barnes faces an impossible choice: continue down the path of bigotry or seek redemption from the one man who can offer him forgiveness. Officer Thomas Barnes has spent his career enforcing the law in a small southern town, never challenged, never questioned, until a routine traffic stop spirals into violence. When Barnes assaults an older black man driving an expensive car, he has no idea his victim is U.S. Army General Elijah Carter, one of the nation's most respected military leaders. The brutal encounter leaves the town reeling, igniting a firestorm of media attention and public outrage. But when General Carter shocks everyone by refusing to press charges, opting instead to meet Barnes face-to-face, the town and the officer are left grappling with the question, why? As Barnes and Carter confront one another, a deeply buried connection between their families surfaces, a revelation that shakes the officer to his core. Carter reveals that Barnes' estranged father, a man Barnes despised for his overt racism, had once saved Carter's life during the Vietnam War. Caught between his own prejudices and the haunting truth of his father's past, Barnes embarks on a journey of redemption he never expected. As the town watches, Barnes must reckon with a lifetime of hatred and make a choice: continue down the path of bigotry or seek forgiveness from the man whose life is more entwined with his own than he ever imagined. Officer Thomas Barnes, 40s. He is stocky, 5 feet 10 inches tall, with short brown hair and a face weathered by years of outdoor service. His piercing blue eyes often reflect his hardened, unapproachable demeanor. His uniform is always pressed, but his expression is often one of controlled anger. Raised in a household where casual racism was normalized, Barnes grew up idolizing his father, a former military man, before their relationship soured. He joined the police force, believing he was upholding tradition and order, but over the years his unbridled prejudices have turned into resentment toward those he considers outsiders. He is divorced and somewhat estranged from his teenage daughter, who has moved in with her mother. General Elijah Carter, late 1950s, early 1960s. He is tall and imposing, standing 6 feet 2 inches tall, with a powerful, muscular build that speaks to his military discipline. His shaved gray hair and piercing brown eyes project authority. He has a deep, resonant voice that is often soothing yet commanding. A highly respected U.S. Army general, Elijah Carter grew up in a small town with humble beginnings. Despite facing racism throughout his life, he rose through the ranks by focusing on integrity and leadership. His decorated military career includes service in Iraq and Afghanistan, where he earned the respect of his peers and his country. Beneath his tough exterior is a man of deep conviction and emotional intelligence, seeking peace and reconciliation where others might see conflict. Susan Barnes, 40. A petite woman with blonde hair and green eyes. Her soft features often reveal the emotional toll of her past marriage. She dresses conservatively, though with a touch of elegance. Susan divorced Thomas years ago, tired of his controlling nature and hidden anger. She moved to a nearby town with her teenage daughter, Rachel, trying to create a better life away from the toxicity of her marriage. Susan supports Rachel's desire to live differently from her father, though she worries that Thomas's influence still looms large over their lives. Rachel Barnes, 16, slim and athletic, with long brown hair and a piercing, questioning gaze. She is a mix of her father's intensity and her mother's compassion, often dressed in casual yet elegant clothing that reflects her independence. Rachel lives with her mother, but struggles with her complicated relationship with her father. Torn between loyalty to him and disgust at his actions, she represents the generational shift away from prejudice. Intelligent and strong-willed, Rachel is determined not to repeat her parents' mistakes, forging her own path and worldview. Sheriff Bill Thornton, 50. A burly man with a graying beard and graying hair. He has a deep, authoritative voice, and often wears a cowboy hat and boots, reflecting his small-town roots. Sheriff Thornton is the town's longtime sheriff, beloved by many but resistant to change. He is an old friend of Barnes and tries to protect him when the attack on General Carter takes place. Over the course of the novel, he realizes the need to confront the town's long-standing racial tensions. The small southern town, name, Cedar Ridge, a quiet, predominantly white town, Cedar Ridge has wide streets lined with charming brick buildings, old oak trees, and a central square with a historic courthouse. Beneath its picturesque surface, however, the town is riven by racial and social tensions. The atmosphere seems frozen in time, with whispers of old prejudices still dictating the social order. The police station, a modest, no-nonsense building with beige walls, flickering fluorescent lights, and worn desks cluttered with papers. It is a reflection of the town, functional but resistant to change. The air is often tense, with the officers embodying the town's old guard. General Elijah Carter's house, a sleek, modern home in a suburban area outside the city, filled with memorabilia from his military career. His home is a stark contrast to the old-fashioned charm of Cedar Ridge: clean lines, polished floors, and walls lined with medals and framed photos from his service. It reflects his disciplined but open-minded worldview. Courthouse Square, the heart of Cedar Ridge, where the courthouse stands as a symbol of the town's heritage. Old red brick buildings surround the square, and a monument to Confederate soldiers stands in the center. It's a place of public discourse, but also a quiet reminder of the troubled history of the incident. The traffic stop quiet road outside of Cedar Ridge. Officer Barnes pulls General Carter over, escalating the situation due to his racial bias. Barnes' confrontation prompts Carter to respond calmly, frustrating Barnes. The attack scenario, roadside. Barnes forcibly pulls Carter from the car and assaults him. Barnes' irrational aggression prompts bystanders to record the incident. Roadside after the assault. A passerby reveals that the man Barnes attacked is General Carter, which shocks him. Barnes begins to feel the weight of his mistake, leading to external consequences. Media frenzy scenario, police station and local newsrooms. The incident goes viral, attracting national media attention. Barnes is thrust into the spotlight, increasing his panic and fear. The request scenario, General Carter's home and sheriff's office. Carter asks to meet with Barnes in private, refusing to press charges. Cause and effect. This request confuses everyone, setting the stage for the confrontation. The confrontation scene 1. Tension at the police station setting. Police station. Barnes prepares to meet General Carter, filled with anxiety. His fear of him grows as he contemplates the possible consequences. The meeting begins. Setting, General Carter's home. Carter invites Barnes in, and instead of accusing him, he begins asking about Barnes' father. This unexpected turn of events shifts Barnes from defensiveness to confusion. The family secret setting, Carter's living room. Carter reveals that he served with Barnes' foreign father in Vietnam and that Barnes' father saved his life. Barnes is shocked, and his perception of his father begins to change. The conversation deepens. Setting, same as above. Carter shares details about their time together, explaining how race played a role even back then. Barnes begins to question his own deep-rooted prejudices, leading to an internal conflict. A new perspective setting. Barnes drives home. When Barnes leaves, he is forced to reconsider everything he believed about his father and himself. The encounter leaves Barnes conflicted, setting up his personal struggle in the next chapter. Confronting the past. Scene 1. Haunted by the truth setting. Barnes' childhood home. Barnes visits his father's abandoned farmhouse, struggling with the revelation of his father's secret. His father's actions begin to challenge Barnes' sense of self. Flashbacks to childhood setting. Barnes' memories. Barnes recalls moments from his childhood, both the overt racism in his home and glimpses of his father's hidden complexity. Barnes' memories conflict with the new information, intensifying his inner turmoil. Confronting his ex-wife setting. Susan's house. Barnes visits his ex-wife Susan, seeking solace, but the conversation quickly turns to his anger and racism. Susan confronts Barnes about his behavior, making him realize how deeply ingrained his prejudices are. Rachel's perspective setting, same as above. Barnes' daughter Rachel overhears the conversation and challenges her father's worldview, bringing up incidents of racism she witnessed growing up. Rachel's words cut deep, forcing Barnes to question how his actions have affected his family. A decision to change setting. Barnes' apartment. Alone in his apartment, Barnes struggles with the decision to confront his prejudices or ignore them. This moment of introspection sets him on a path toward change, though he is unsure of how to begin. The burden of legacy. Scene 1. Revisiting the police station setting. Police station. Barnes returns to work, haunted by guilt. The atmosphere at the precinct is tense as his fellow officers treat him differently after the media exposure. Barnes begins to realize how deeply ingrained racism is within the force, leading to discomfort. Warning from Sheriff Thornton setting. The sheriff's office. Sheriff Thornton warns Barnes to keep his head down and avoid further attention, revealing his own complicity in the town's racism. Thornton's words prompt Barnes to distance himself from the toxic culture at the precinct. A surprising ally setting. Police station. Another officer, a young black man named Marcus. Returning to General Carter's house. Barnes visits Carter again, asking for advice on how to make amends. Carter challenges Barnes to not only apologize, but to stand up against the system that perpetuates racism. A plan in action setting. Barnes' apartment. Inspired by Carter, Barnes begins to quietly plan how he can confront the systemic problems in the police force. This decision sets the stage for Barnes to take action in the following chapters. The cost of change. Scene 1. Backlash at the station setting. Police station. Barnes begins to speak out against some of the practices at the station, which leads to friction with his colleagues. His actions cause an immediate backlash as the officers begin to ostracize him. Tensions rise. Setting. Cedar Ridge City Hall. Rumors spread about Barnes' change of heart, and town leaders begin to pressure the sheriff to deal with him. The mounting pressure creates tension, setting the stage for a confrontation. Confronting Thornton. Sheriff's office. Barnes confronts Sheriff Thornton, accusing him of turning a blind eye to racism in his department. Thornton threatens to fire him if he continues. This confrontation pushes Barnes closer to taking a stand that could cost him his job. Rachel's support. Susan's house. Rachel, witnessing her father's struggle, reaches out to support him, signaling the healing of their fractured relationship. Rachel's encouragement strengthens Barnes' resolve to keep fighting, despite the consequences. The breaking point. Police station. A confrontation at the station escalates when another officer threatens Marcus Johnson, and Barnes steps in to protect him. Cause and effect. This act of defiance becomes the final straw, leading to Barnes being suspended or fired, setting up the climax in the next chapter. Barnes's lowest point. Barnes's apartment. Suspended and ostracized, Barnes feels like he has lost everything. He considers giving up. Barnes' isolation prepares him for a final moment of clarity that leads him to take action. A public stand setting. Town hall meeting. Barnes attends a town hall meeting, where tensions between the police and the community are at a breaking point. Barnes speaks, publicly apologizing for his actions and calling for systemic change. His public apology and call for reform galvanizes support from some in the city and surprises others, particularly General Carter. Carter's gesture setting. General Carter's home. After the town hall, Carter invites Barnes to his home once again, this time offering him something unexpected, a recommendation that Barnes seek a job that directly combats systemic injustice. This final act of mentorship from Carter prompts Barnes to consider a new path in life. A new beginning. Barnes' apartment. Barnes, now unemployed but filled with a sense of purpose, decides to join an organization that aims to reform policing and address racial inequality. This sets up the conclusion, where Barnes finds redemption not through the law he once enforced, but through the fight for justice. Looking ahead. The road out of Cedar Ridge. In the final scene, Barnes drives past the place where he first stopped General Carter, reflecting on how much he has changed in such a short time. As he drives, the future remains uncertain, but for the first time, Barnes feels like he is on the right path. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a golden hue over the quiet road that stretched just outside of Cedar Ridge. Officer Thomas Barnes squinted through the windshield of his patrol car as he spotted a sleek, black sedan up ahead. It wasn't just the car that caught his attention. It was who was behind the wheel. A black man in a car like that, on this road, in this town? Barnes gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw clenching. Not on my watch, he muttered under his breath as he flicked on his lights and siren. The sedan slowed, pulling to the side of the road. Barnes parked behind it, his heart already racing with irritation. He stepped out of the patrol car, adjusting his belt, and made his way to the driver's side window, already composing his opening remarks in his head. The window lowered, revealing an older black man with calm, piercing eyes. He greeted Barnes with a nod, his hands resting visibly on the steering wheel. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" the man asked, his tone respectful but firm. Barnes hated it, the calm, the composure. It felt like defiance. "License and registration," Barnes barked, ignoring the question. The man obliged, handing over the documents without hesitation. Barnes barely glanced at them before looking back at the driver. "What brings you out here?" Barnes asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. "Just passing through, officer. I'm on my way to visit some family," the man responded, his gaze steady, unflinching. It only irked Barnes further. He scanned the car, searching for something, anything, that could give him cause to escalate. The tension was palpable, and it gnawed at Barnes. The man's calmness only made him want to break it. "Step out of the car," Barnes ordered. The driver's eyebrows raised slightly in surprise. "Officer, I don't think that's necessary." "I said, step out of the car." Barnes cut him off, his hand moving to his holster. The man exhaled deeply, his eyes flashing a moment of frustration, but he complied. As he opened the door and stepped onto the gravel shoulder, Barnes moved in close, eyeing him up and down, looking for any excuse to take control of the situation. Barnes didn't wait for the man to make another move before grabbing his arm. He pushed him toward the side of the car with unnecessary force, pinning him against the hood. The man grimaced but didn't resist, his hands flat on the cool metal of the car. "Is this really necessary?" he asked, his voice still calm, but the tension was unmistakable now. Barnes leaned in closer, his breath hot and heavy. "Necessary? You're damn right it is. You think you can just drive through here without consequences?" His grip tightened on the man's wrist, and a flash of pain crossed the man's face. "I've done nothing wrong," the man said through gritted teeth. Barnes wasn't listening anymore. His own frustration, built up over years of dealing with the world through the narrow lens of his upbringing, boiled over. He slammed the man harder against the car, eliciting a pained grunt. Suddenly, a honk from a passing car startled them both. Barnes turned his head and noticed the car slowing, the occupants inside looking on with concern. Another car slowed down behind it, and Barnes could feel eyes on him. "Stay out of this," Barnes yelled at the onlookers, his voice cracking with the strain of his fury. But it was too late. Several phones were already raised, recording the scene. His heart pounded in his chest, not out of fear, but out of the growing realization that things were spiraling out of control. He had to end this now. Without thinking, Barnes yanked the man's arms behind his back, snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. The man stood tall, despite the assault, his breathing controlled, his eyes focused ahead. "This isn't right," the man said quietly. But Barnes wasn't listening. He was too busy looking around, realizing that the eyes of Cedar Ridge were on him now. With the man in cuffs, Barnes dragged him toward the back of the patrol car, his adrenaline still surging. But then he heard a voice from behind. "Stop. What the hell are you doing?" "That's General Elijah Carter." Barnes froze. He turned slowly to face the man who had yelled from one of the stopped cars, disbelief tightening his throat. "General?" He looked back at the man in cuffs, his heart plummeting as the name clicked in his head. "You're General Carter?" Barnes' voice cracked. The man before him, still calm despite the assault, simply nodded. His silence was deafening. Barnes' mouth went dry. He knew who General Elijah Carter was, a decorated U.S. Army general, known for his leadership and integrity. Barnes had read about him, seen him on television during his return from Afghanistan. The man he had just attacked was a national hero. Barnes' hands shook as he fumbled with the keys to the cuffs. I didn't know." Carter watched him, his gaze unrelenting but not accusatory. "I tried to tell you," he said quietly as Barnes freed his wrists. Suddenly, the weight of what he had done crushed Barnes' chest. The situation wasn't just spiraling. It had already imploded. Within hours, the story hit the local news. It was all over Cedar Ridge and spreading fast. Local officer assaults U.S. Army general in unprovoked attack. Barnes watched the news from his small, cluttered apartment that night, his head in his hands. Every major outlet was covering it. Every screen he looked at had his face plastered across it. He didn't need to check his phone to know what the fallout was going to be. His voicemail was full of angry messages, most from people he didn't even know. The sheriff had already called, demanding an explanation. But what could he say? At the police station the next day, the tension was thick. Barnes entered through the back door, avoiding the reporters that had gathered out front. His fellow officers shot him looks of pity, confusion, and disdain. He could feel his career crumbling beneath his feet. Sheriff Bill Thornton pulled him into his office, slamming the door shut behind him. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Thornton growled. His face was red, veins popping along his temples. Barnes had never seen him this angry. "I didn't know, Bill. I didn't know who he was," Barnes stammered, his voice weak. "That doesn't matter, Barnes. You put your hands on a U.S. general in front of half the town. This is beyond fixing." Thornton ran a hand through his graying hair, pacing behind his desk. Barnes slumped into the chair, guilt and fear twisting inside him. He was losing everything. And yet, the worst part was the growing realization that it wasn't just his career at risk. It was something deeper, something inside him that he couldn't yet name. Later that evening, as Barnes prepared to face yet another barrage of reporters outside his apartment, his phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and saw an unknown number. Hesitantly, he answered. "Officer Barnes?" The voice was calm, measured. Barnes recognized it instantly. "General Carter?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'd like to meet with you, officer. Just the two of us." Barnes' stomach dropped. "Why?" The word slipped out before he could stop it. He had been bracing for a lawsuit, a public condemnation, something to bring him down completely. But this didn't make sense. "I think it's time we talked," Carter said simply. His voice held no anger, no accusation, just quiet authority. Barnes swallowed hard. He didn't know why General Carter wanted to meet with him, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Barnes sat at his desk, his eyes unfocused, staring at the stack of paperwork that had accumulated over the past few days. The clatter of phones, the voices of officers, and the faint hum of conversation all seemed distant. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by the upcoming meeting with General Elijah Carter. He hadn't slept the night before. How could he? The weight of his actions hung over him like a dark cloud, suffocating his thoughts. He had assaulted a U.S. Army general, a man who had spent his life defending the very principles Barnes had sworn to uphold as a police officer. The irony stung deep. "Barnes, you in there?" Sheriff Thornton's gruff voice pulled him out of his haze. The sheriff stood in the doorway of Barnes' office, his arms crossed over his chest. Barnes blinked, sitting up straighter. "Yeah, I'm here." Thornton eyed him for a moment, the tension between them palpable. Since the incident, the sheriff had been walking on eggshells around Barnes, not sure whether to offer support or to distance himself from the fallout. "You're still meeting with him, right? General Carter?" Barnes nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "This afternoon." Thornton sighed, shaking his head. "I don't get why he wants to meet. You'd think he'd be pressing charges or calling for your badge. Instead, I don't know either," Barnes cut in, "but I'm going. Whatever he has to say, I need to hear it." Thornton hesitated before stepping closer, his voice lowering. "Listen, Barnes, you've made a mess of things. But whatever happens today, you've got to keep your cool. Don't make things worse." Barnes nodded, though he wasn't sure how much worse things could get. The pit in his stomach deepened as the clock in the corner of the room ticked closer to the meeting time. Barnes pulled up to the address General Carter had provided, an impressive, modern home set back in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The sleek lines of the house, with its glass walls and minimalist design, stood in stark contrast to the old-fashioned charm of Cedar Ridge. Everything about the place exuded discipline and precision, much like the man who lived there. Barnes parked his patrol car at the curb and sat for a moment, staring at the house. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He hadn't been this nervous in a long time. With a deep breath, he stepped out and walked to the front door. Before he could knock, the door opened, revealing General Carter. The man stood tall, his expression unreadable, his posture as commanding as ever. "Officer Barnes," Carter greeted him, his deep voice calm but firm. "General," Barnes managed, his own voice coming out weaker than he had intended. "Come in," Carter said, stepping aside to let Barnes enter. The interior of the house was just as immaculate as the exterior, clean, modern, and lined with photos and memorabilia from Carter's military career. Barnes felt a pang of discomfort as he glanced at the medals and framed photographs of a life dedicated to service. What right did he have to be standing in this man's home? "Have a seat," Carter gestured to the living room, where a sleek leather couch faced a large window with a view of the garden. Barnes sat down, trying to steady his nerves. Carter remained standing for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back, before he took a seat across from Barnes. The silence between them stretched, heavy and tense. "I suppose you're wondering why I asked you here," Carter said finally, his voice measured. Barnes nodded, unable to find his voice. Carter leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You see, Officer Barnes, what happened on that roadside wasn't just about you and me. It was about something much larger, something that's been simmering beneath the surface for a long time. But I didn't bring you here to lecture you." Barnes shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his palms sweating. "Then why did you?" Carter's gaze was unyielding. "Because there's something you don't know about your own history, about your father." Barnes blinked in confusion. His father? What did any of this have to do with his father? "What are you talking about?" Barnes asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Carter didn't flinch. "Your father and I served together in Vietnam. I doubt you knew that." Barnes felt the world tilt slightly. His father, a man who had spent most of his life spewing hateful rhetoric and raising him in the shadow of bigotry, had served alongside General Carter? It didn't seem possible. "No," Barnes muttered. "I didn't know." Carter's face softened, just slightly. "Your father wasn't the man you think he was. He saved my life once, during an ambush. We were surrounded, and if it weren't for him, I wouldn't be sitting here right now." Barnes sat frozen, the words refusing to settle. His father, the man he had looked up to in his youth, only to become disillusioned by his later years, had saved a black man's life? It contradicted everything he thought he knew. "You're lying," Barnes said, but there was no conviction behind the words. "I have no reason to lie, officer, and you have every reason to reconsider the beliefs you've inherited." Carter leaned back, his eyes still fixed on Barnes. "Your father and I weren't friends. There was still plenty of prejudice between us, but in that moment, he chose to save me. That choice shaped the rest of my life, and it could shape yours too, if you let it." Barnes' mind raced. The image of his father, a man who had shaped his worldview so completely, was now unraveling before him. This revelation made him question not only his father but himself, his values, his prejudices, everything he thought he knew. Carter didn't stop there. He began to share stories of their time together in Vietnam, stories that painted a picture far more complicated than Barnes had ever imagined. His father had been a soldier, a leader, but also a man deeply conflicted by the racial divide that defined much of their time in the military. "There were moments," Carter said quietly, "when your father would challenge the racism around him. He wasn't perfect, but he wasn't the man you grew up believing he was either." Barnes sat back, feeling the weight of those words press against his chest. His father, for all his flaws, had shown moments of decency. Barnes' own actions over the years, fueled by the beliefs instilled in him, now felt hollow, misguided. Carter paused, watching Barnes closely, before continuing. "I'm not here to tell you what to do with this information, Barnes. That's your decision. But I wanted you to know the truth, because it's time you faced it." The truth. Barnes felt like the ground beneath him had shifted, leaving him standing on unsteady legs. For so long, he had built his identity on a foundation laid by his father. Now that foundation was crumbling, and he didn't know who he was anymore. As Barnes drove away from Carter's house, the weight of the conversation sat heavy on his shoulders. He barely noticed the passing trees or the familiar roads that led back to Cedar Ridge. His mind was consumed by the revelations that had been dropped in his lap. His father had saved a man's life, a black man's life, and not just any man, but Elijah Carter, the very man Barnes had assaulted. The universe had a cruel sense of irony. The anger, the guilt, the confusion, they all swirled together in his chest, choking him. He had always justified his actions by clinging to his father's teachings, but now those teachings felt empty. What had he been fighting for all these years? The words Carter had spoken echoed in his mind. It's time you faced the truth. But what was he supposed to do with that truth? Barnes had no idea where to begin. He had spent his entire life building walls between himself and anyone who didn't fit his narrow worldview. Now those walls were being torn down, and all that was left was the painful, vulnerable reality of who he truly was. As he pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine, Barnes sat for a long time in silence. He was at a crossroads, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know which direction to take. Barnes had driven without thinking, the words of General Carter echoing in his mind. His father, the man he had worshipped as a boy but came to resent as he grew older. The man who had filled his head with ideas about how the world worked, ideas about race, authority, and superiority. The very same man, according to General Carter, had risked his life to save a black soldier during the Vietnam War. It didn't make sense. The road became familiar, though he barely noticed it at first. As he pulled up to the old farmhouse where he'd grown up, Barnes finally took in his surroundings. The house had seen better days, the white paint now chipped and weathered, the porch sagging. It was a shell of the place he remembered. Barnes sat in his car for a moment, staring at the house. His father's ghost seemed to linger in the peeling wood and creaking steps. He hadn't been back here since his father's death 5 years ago, but something had pulled him here now. Maybe it was the weight of Carter's words, the need to reconcile the father he thought he knew with the one Carter described. He stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under his boots as he made his way to the porch. The door groaned as he pushed it open, revealing a house frozen in time. Dust coated the furniture, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. It was as though his father had simply walked out one day and never returned. Barnes wandered through the house, his thoughts swirling. The memories were overwhelming. Moments of admiration for the man who had seemed invincible, followed by bitter arguments as Barnes grew older and began to see the flaws in his father's worldview. He stopped at the mantel, his eyes resting on an old photograph of his father in uniform, standing tall and proud. He saved General Carter's life. The thought twisted inside him, conflicting with the image of the man in his mind. Otis Barnes stood there. Memories from his childhood flooded back. He could see himself as a young boy, trailing after his father, hanging on his every word. His father had been a man of discipline, of hard lines and rules. Everything had been black and white to him. There were good people and bad people, and those two groups didn't mix. Barnes remembered the first time he had heard his father use a racial slur. He had been only 10, and they were sitting at the dinner table. His father had been angry about something he saw on the news, something about race riots in the city. Barnes hadn't understood much at the time, but he had absorbed every word his father said. Those words had shaped him, embedding themselves deep in his mind. There had been good times, too. Barnes remembered the days his father took him fishing or taught him how to shoot. Those were the moments when he had felt close to his father, felt proud to be his son. But as he grew older, those moments became fewer and further between. The disagreements started, about race, about justice, about how the world really worked. By the time Barnes was a teenager, the man he once idolized had become a source of frustration. His father's views seemed so rigid, so outdated. They argued constantly, and by the time Barnes left for the police academy, their relationship had all but disintegrated. Barnes ran a hand through his hair, sighing. He had spent so much time distancing himself from his father's harsh words and beliefs, but now he wondered, had he really been so different? The drive to his ex-wife Susan's house felt longer than it usually did, but Barnes knew he needed to talk to her. Susan had always been able to cut through his defenses, even after their divorce. She had a way of making him face the things he tried to avoid, and right now, he needed someone to help him make sense of everything. When he arrived, Susan opened the door, her face a mixture of surprise and caution. They had never been close after the divorce, but she had always kept the door open for him, for the sake of their daughter, Rachel. "Thomas," she greeted, stepping aside to let him in. Barnes didn't waste any time. "I need to talk about my father." Susan raised an eyebrow, folding her arms as she leaned against the counter. "Your father? After all these years?" "I met someone," Barnes said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "A man, General Carter. He knew my father. They served together in Vietnam." Susan listened quietly, her expression unreadable. "And?" Barnes exhaled, the tension in his chest building. "He said my father saved his life. That my father wasn't the man I thought he was." Susan nodded slowly. "And that's hard for you to hear, isn't it?" Barnes looked at her, his frustration mounting. "Of course it is. My whole life, I've been trying to live up to his standards, trying to be the man he was, and now I find out that maybe he wasn't as simple as I thought." Susan's gaze softened, but there was something else there, something that hinted at a deeper truth. "Thomas, you've been running from your father's shadow for years. Maybe now it's time to face it." Barnes clenched his fists. "I've tried. I've done everything I can to be my own man, to build my own life. But I can't escape him." Susan stepped closer, her voice low and steady. "You haven't escaped him, Thomas. You've been living by the same rules he did, even if you thought you were different." Barnes looked away, her words cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe it's time to stop fighting his ghost and start figuring out who you are, without him." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps coming down the stairs. Rachel appeared in the doorway, her eyes shifting between her parents. "What's going on?" Barnes tensed, unsure how to explain everything to his daughter. Rachel was 16, smart and independent, but their relationship had been strained for years. She had inherited Susan's critical eye and wasn't afraid to speak her mind, especially when it came to Barnes' views on the world. "We were just talking," Susan said gently. Rachel frowned, her arms crossing over her chest. "About Grandpa?" Barnes hesitated. "Yeah." Rachel's expression shifted, her voice taking on a harder edge. "You mean the man who hated everyone who wasn't exactly like him?" Barnes flinched at the accusation, but he couldn't argue. Rachel had always seen through the layers of civility that Barnes had tried to maintain. She wasn't afraid to call out the racism she had witnessed growing up, whether it came from her grandfather or her father. "Rachel," Barnes started, unsure of where to begin. "You've always defended him," Rachel cut him off, her voice sharp. "Even when you knew he was wrong." "I didn't always agree with him," Barnes shot back, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they rang hollow. Rachel shook her head. "But you still followed in his footsteps. You still acted like him. Don't you see that?" The room fell silent, Rachel's words hanging in the air. Barnes stared at his daughter, the sting of her accusation settling deep inside him. She was right. He had been following in his father's footsteps for far too long, even when he thought he was breaking away. Later that night, Barnes sat alone in his small apartment, the weight of the day pressing down on him. His conversation with Rachel had opened his eyes in a way that nothing else had. For years, he had tried to distance himself from his father, to live a life that wasn't dictated by the man's prejudices and beliefs. But in doing so, he had only succeeded in carrying those same beliefs forward, internalizing them, letting them shape his actions without even realizing it. He thought about General Carter, about the man who had revealed the truth about his father, who had shown him that people weren't as simple as they seemed. Carter's words had been a challenge, one that Barnes wasn't sure he was ready to accept. Barnes looked at the photo of his father he had brought home from the farmhouse. It sat on the table in front of him, staring back at him with a mixture of pride and expectation. For the first time, Barnes realized he didn't have to live up to those expectations. He didn't have to follow the same path. He could be different. Barnes took a deep breath, the tension in his chest loosening for the first time in days. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to be his father anymore. He was going to find his own way, even if it meant tearing down everything he thought he knew. With that decision, Barnes felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He wasn't sure where the path would lead, but he was ready to walk it. Barnes ran a hand through his hair, sighing. He had spent so much time distancing himself from his father's harsh words and beliefs, but now he wondered, had he really been so different? The drive to his ex-wife Susan's house felt longer than it usually did, but Barnes knew he needed to talk to her. Susan had always been able to cut through his defenses, even after their divorce. She had a way of making him face the things he tried to avoid, and right now, he needed someone to help him make sense of everything. When he arrived, Susan opened the door, her face a mixture of surprise and caution. They had never been close after the divorce, but she had always kept a door open for him, for the sake of their daughter, Rachel. "Thomas," she greeted, stepping aside to let him in. Barnes didn't waste any time. "I need to talk about my father." Susan raised an eyebrow, folding her arms as she leaned against the counter. "Your father? After all these years?" "I met someone," Barnes said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "A man, General Carter. He knew my father. They served together in Vietnam." Susan listened quietly, her expression unreadable. "And?" Barnes exhaled, the tension in his chest building. "He said my father saved his life. That my father wasn't the man I thought he was." Susan nodded slowly. "And that's hard for you to hear, isn't it?" Barnes looked at her, his frustration mounting. "Of course it is. My whole life, I've been trying to live up to his standards, trying to be the man he was, and now I find out that maybe he wasn't as simple as I thought." Susan's gaze softened, but there was something else there, something that hinted at a deeper truth. "Thomas, you've been running from your father's shadow for years. Maybe now it's time to face it." Barnes clenched his fists. "I've tried. I've done everything I can to be my own man, to build my own life. But I can't escape him." Susan stepped closer, her voice low and steady. "You haven't escaped him, Thomas. You've been living by the same rules he did, even if you thought you were different." Barnes looked away, her words cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe it's time to stop fighting his ghost and start figuring out who you are, without him." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps coming down the stairs. Rachel appeared in the doorway, her eyes shifting between her parents. "What's going on?" Barnes tensed, unsure how to explain everything to his daughter. Rachel was 16, smart and independent, but their relationship had been strained for years. She had inherited Susan's critical eye and wasn't afraid to speak her mind, especially when it came to Barnes' views on the world. "We were just talking," Susan said gently. Rachel frowned, her arms crossing over her chest. "About Grandpa?" Barnes hesitated. "Yeah." Rachel's expression shifted, her voice taking on a harder edge. "You mean the man who hated everyone who wasn't exactly like him?" Barnes flinched at the accusation, but he couldn't argue. Rachel had always seen through the layers of civility that Barnes had tried to maintain. She wasn't afraid to call out the racism she had witnessed growing up, whether it came from her grandfather or her father. "Rachel," Barnes started, unsure of where to begin. "You've always defended him," Rachel cut him off, her voice sharp. "Even when you knew he was wrong." "I didn't always agree with him," Barnes shot back, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they rang hollow. Rachel shook her head. "But you still followed in his footsteps. You still acted like him. Don't you see that?" The room fell silent, Rachel's words hanging in the air. Barnes stared at his daughter, the sting of her accusation settling deep inside him. She was right. He had been following in his father's footsteps for far too long, even when he thought he was breaking away. Later that night, Barnes sat alone in his small apartment, the weight of the day pressing down on him. His conversation with Rachel had opened his eyes in a way that nothing else had. For years, he had tried to distance himself from his father, to live a life that wasn't dictated by the man's prejudices and beliefs. But in doing so, he had only succeeded in carrying those same beliefs forward, internalizing them, letting them shape his actions without even realizing it. He thought about General Carter, about the man who had revealed the truth about his father, who had shown him that people weren't as simple as they seemed. Carter's words had been a challenge, one that Barnes wasn't sure he was ready to accept. Barnes looked at the photo of his father he had brought home from the farmhouse. It sat on the table in front of him, staring back at him with a mixture of pride and expectation. For the first time, Barnes realized he didn't have to live up to those expectations. He didn't have to follow the same path. He could be different. Barnes took a deep breath, the tension in his chest loosening for the first time in days. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to be his father anymore. He was going to find his own way, even if it meant tearing down everything he thought he knew. With that decision, Barnes felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He wasn't sure where the path would lead, but he was ready to walk it.